The boxes were custom-made. Not custom-made for shipping, not custom-made for storage, custom-made to fit through the teller windows at HSBC bank branches in Mexico. The Sinaloa Cartel, one of the most violent criminal organizations in the world, had measured the dimensions of the bank's windows precisely. And then they built wooden boxes exactly that size so their operatives could slide hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash across the counter in a single transaction. Not once, not occasionally, every single day. And the bank processed it. For years. In 2012, the United States Department of Justice announced a settlement with HSBC, at the time the largest bank in Europe and one of the 5 largest in the world. HSBC had admitted to laundering at least $881 million in drug proceeds for the Sinaloa Cartel and other trafficking organizations. It had also admitted to processing transactions for Iran, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, and Burma, countries under strict US sanctions, by deliberately stripping identifying information from wire transfers so regulators couldn't trace them. The fine was $1.92 billion. No executive went to prison, not one, not even for a day. This is the story of how that happened. Not the cartel side, not the drugs, the bank side. The boardrooms, the memos, the lawyers, the decision, made at the highest levels of the United States government, that some institutions are simply too large to be held accountable under the same laws that apply to everyone else. And what that decision says about how the financial system actually works. HSBC was founded in 1865. The initials stand for Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. It was built, from the beginning, to move money across borders. That was the business. British colonial trade, opium revenue from China, later financing across Asia, the Middle East, Latin America. By the 2000s, HSBC operated in 80 countries. It had roughly 300,000 employees. Its net income in 2011, the year before the settlement, was $16.8 billion. It was not a fringe institution. It was not a rogue bank. It was one of the pillars of the global financial system. And it was running what federal prosecutors would later describe as one of the most brazen money laundering operations in American banking history. To understand how this happened, you need to understand one number: $7 billion. That is the amount that HSBC's Mexico affiliate wired to its US affiliate in 2007 and 2008 alone. $7 billion. In 2 years. Federal investigators later noted that this volume was larger than the transfers sent by significantly bigger Mexican banks. There was no legitimate explanation for it. The numbers made no sense unless a large portion of that cash was not coming from ordinary customers. Inside the bank, people knew. Compliance officers, the people whose job is specifically to flag suspicious transactions, had been raising alarms for years. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which released a 339-page report on the case in July 2012, found that HSBC executives had been receiving internal warnings about Mexico since at least 2002. They were ignored. A senior HSBC executive later described the problem as a lack of a compliance culture in the Mexico affiliate. That is a careful phrase. What it means in plain language is this: the people responsible for catching money laundering were systematically sidelined, underfunded, and overruled. The Senate report found that compliance officers were treated as, in the words of multiple former employees, a second-class workforce, with little power to shut down accounts and almost no ability to enforce decisions against the wishes of the business side. One internal HSBC email, quoted in the Senate investigation, lamented that the bank stood to lose $2.6 billion in revenue if it was forced to close the US dollar accounts connected to the Mexico operation. That email was not a warning, it was a complaint about losing income. Here is what the cartel was actually doing. Drug money is physical. A kilogram of cocaine sold on American streets generates tens of thousands of dollars in small bills. That cash cannot be deposited directly into a bank account without triggering reports to regulators. It cannot be wired internationally. It cannot be used to buy property or pay suppliers. It has to be cleaned first. It has to enter the legitimate financial system in a form that looks normal. The Sinaloa cartel solution was elegantly simple. Bring the cash to Mexico, where banking controls were weaker. Deposit it in bulk at HSBC branches, using those custom-built boxes to move it through the teller windows as efficiently as possible. Once it was inside HSBC Mexico, it became a legitimate bank transfer. HSBC Mexico would then wire the money to HSBC's US affiliate in New York. From there, it could go anywhere in the world. Between 2006 and 2010, at least $881 million moved through this pipeline. That is the amount prosecutors could document. No one knows the real total. On December 11, 2012, Assistant Attorney General Lanny Breuer stood at a podium in New York and announced the settlement. $1.92 billion. A deferred prosecution agreement. 5 years of probation, during which HSBC's compliance would be monitored by a court-appointed watchdog. Some senior executives would have their bonuses partially deferred. Breuer called it a record penalty. He said it sent a powerful message. What he did not announce was any criminal charge. Against the bank, against any subsidiary, against any individual executive. The rank-and-file prosecutors who had worked the case, who had prepared, according to reporting at the time, a list of up to 175 potential criminal charges, were overruled. Breuer explained why. Had the US authorities decided to press criminal charges, he said, HSBC would almost certainly have lost its banking license in the US. The future of the institution would have been under threat, and the entire banking system would have been destabilized. That sentence deserves to be read slowly. The argument was not that HSBC was innocent. HSBC admitted guilt. The argument was that HSBC was too large to prosecute, that the consequences of applying the law would be worse than the consequences of not applying it. Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa, a Republican, wrote to Attorney General Eric Holder the following day. "What I have seen from the department," Grassley wrote, "is an inexplicable unwillingness to prosecute and convict those responsible for aiding and abetting drug lords and terrorists. By allowing these individuals to walk away without any real punishment, the department is declaring that crime actually does pay." Attorney General Holder himself, testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee a few months later, said something that surprised even his critics. "I am concerned," Holder said, "that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy." The Attorney General of the United States had just confirmed, under oath, that the law did not apply equally to institutions above a certain size. It was not a scandal. There was no resignation. No congressional hearing shut anything down. It was just the way things worked. The settlement was supposed to be the end. It was not. In 2020, as part of a massive leak of financial intelligence reports, what journalists called the FinCEN Files, it emerged that HSBC had continued moving suspicious money even while under the court-appointed monitor, even while on probation, even after admitting guilt and paying the largest bank settlement in American history at that point. The FinCEN Files showed HSBC moving hundreds of millions of dollars for clients flagged by its own internal systems as suspicious, during the probationary period that was supposed to demonstrate the bank had changed. More than a dozen former HSBC compliance officers told journalists they had raised concerns during this period and been ignored. Again, the court-appointed watchdog monitoring HSBC's compliance was eventually allowed to complete his term and leave. His final assessment of the bank's progress was not made public. HSBC was never indicted. There is a version of this story where the Justice Department made the right call. HSBC employed 300,000 people. It operated across 80 countries. Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm that collapsed after its conviction in the Enron scandal, had taken down 25,000 jobs when it lost its license. The concern about systemic consequences was not invented. Large financial institutions are structurally embedded in the economy in ways that individual criminals are not. When you send a drug dealer to prison, the economy does not notice. When you revoke the banking license of an institution that processes trillions of dollars in global transactions, the consequences could be impossible to predict. The argument Lanny Breuer made was not stupid. It was, in a narrow technical sense, defensible. What it was not is equal, because the logic that protected HSBC applies only to institutions large enough to matter. It does not apply to the street-level distributor. It does not apply to the cartel operative who built the boxes. It does not apply to the thousands of people imprisoned across the United States for drug crimes connected to the same supply chain that moved through HSBC's teller windows. The law, in practice, had two tiers, one for people, one for institutions that had become too large to hold accountable. The $1.92 billion fine sounds enormous. HSBC's annual profit the year before the settlement was $16.8 billion. The fine was approximately 6 weeks of profit. Some analysts calculated it closer to 5. The bank's stock did not collapse on the day the settlement was announced. It did not even fall significantly. Investors had been anticipating the settlement for months. They had already priced it in. Within 3 years, HSBC had earned back the cost of the fine many times over. No one was punished in any way that cost them more than they could absorb. The custom-built boxes fit the teller windows. The settlement fit the business model. HSBC still operates in more than 60 countries. It is still one of the largest banks in the world. The executives who ran the institution during the years when $881 million in cartel money moved through its accounts, most of them retired with their compensation intact. The deferred prosecution agreement expired in 2017. No criminal charges were ever filed. The phrase that came to define this moment, coined not by activists but by Eric Holder himself, was "too big to jail." It was not a criticism, it was a description of policy, and it remains to this day the honest answer to the question of whether the same rules apply to everyone. They do not. The size of your institution determines the size of your accountability. That is not a conspiracy. It is not a secret. It is simply how the system works, when the system is working exactly as designed.